go. Keep it coming. Push. Push, Max. Let's go. 1, rest.
Hi everyone, and welcome to my short case study where I present an annual strength and power plan for building a bigger, stronger, faster track sprint cyclist. My name is Chris Brandner and I'm currently the strength and conditioning coach at the New South Wales Institute of Sport, with cycling being one of the main sport disciplines that I've been working with. The case study that I would like to introduce is a 21-year-old male sprint cyclist. He was part of Cycling Australia's Podium Pathway program for the national men's team sprint. While he was part of the podium group of athletes, at the time he was outside of the top 4 men's team that went on to win bronze at the 2024 Olympic Games. Ultimately, he still needed to improve his track times in order to break into the national team. Track cycling is a high-intensity, explosive sport where athletes race around an indoor velodrome at speeds of more than 80 kilometers per hour. Events include the team sprint, keirin, and 1v1 match sprint. In order to qualify for the match sprint, performances are set in a flying 200-meter effort, and this is often used to benchmark athlete performances year on year. Developing powerful athletes, those that can push high wattage and sustained efforts in order to accelerate and overcome large gear ratios, is ultimately what is required to do well in the sport. Power on the bike is calculated as torque, or rotational force, and cadence, or RPM. In the S&C world, we talk about power development as force times velocity, and so there's a large crossover between the disciplines. In order to enhance power, and not ignoring the technical, tactical, and mental factors, but in terms of physical, sprint cyclists need to increase lean mass and enhance function of muscle force. The literature shows that thigh muscle mass or volumes, maximal dynamic and isometric strength show really high correlations with sprinting speeds, lap times, peak power, and coaches' ranking. And so what actually matters when we're talking about our cycling performance? It's time. The fastest athlete wins. The first one across the line wins. And if we know this, we can then break down to our physical determinants of performance as well as the associated tests in order for us to then measure these qualities. And in my program in particular, we looked at the following tests as part of this 12-month training plan. And so with a flying 200-meter time of 9.86 seconds, our athletes' performances had somewhat stalled when we look at 2022 and 2023 seasons during the national championships. His time hadn't improved by all that much. So at the beginning of the season, the coach gave some implicit instructions to the performance support team on the changes to this athlete's program and how we were going to do things for the 2024-2025 season. For S&C, this was simple. Get bigger, get stronger, and get faster. For strength, our athlete was in the 80th to 85th percentile according to the national benchmarks. For power, when we looked at counter movement jump and squat jump performance, he was in the 95th percentile, but I knew this could still be improved. And for bike power output, he was behind the national men's team program by approximately 300 to 400 watts. Now we get into planning and start with the broader annual plan. Typically, the sprints coach would program the annual plan for a single peak, aiming to peak performance at the Australian National Championships in March of every year. In this case, this would give us 9 months of physical preparation. After discussion with the National Sprint Program, who often have more competitions throughout the annual calendar than what we do at the developmental level, we decided to prescribe for 2 to 3 peak performances throughout the season, which look like 2 general physical prep phases followed by a single specific physical prep phase aiming to freshen up his performances. And we would get 2 to 3 of these cycles leading into the national championships. Our gym days throughout the season were 3 times per week on alternate days, Monday, Wednesday and Friday. And track sessions on the bike were 4 days per week, on the same days as gym but with 4 to 5 hours recovery between sessions, and a longer speed endurance session on the Saturday morning. This totaled 7 sessions per week. Listed now are the set and repetition schemes and estimated loading schemes for each phase across the season, where you can observe higher volumes in GPP1 and GPP2, increasing intensities throughout the SPP periods, as well as more range-specific strength. Some other niche programming points of interest include the use of GymAware for velocity feedback, with some good research coming out about the use of velocity loss thresholds during training and training outcomes with higher velocity loss associated with hypertrophy and smaller losses with strength and power. So that was useful in our early season preparation. Speaking of hypertrophy and higher training volumes, we used a lot of blood flow restriction training throughout our GPP periods, as well as a lot of accessory strength lifts, such as single leg hip extension, knee flexion and extension exercises. The third thing you might see is the use of isometrics at various stages throughout the year to develop peak isometric force outputs, something that I'll discuss later in this presentation. While I let the video play out, which captures some of the testing and training that took place during the general physical preparation phases of training throughout the year, highlighting some of the exercises that we used, the use of velocity-based feedback and BFR training too. One of the main considerations when considering developing muscle hypertrophy as well as strength in selecting exercises is the primary power producers on the bike. On the left-hand side, you see a nice graphical display of the muscles and EMG activity during the pedal stroke. Approximately 80 to 85% of power is produced during the downstroke of the pedal during hip and knee extension. Therefore, the muscles around this area are most important to develop. Thus, the program that you'll see on the next slide is directed towards improving size and strength qualities of the hip and knee extensors, as well as the calf-ankle complex and the upper body, and in order to ensure that there is no energy leakage from the pedals to over the bars. As I mentioned, throughout the year, gym sessions took place 3 times per week. During the GPP phases of training, there was a greater emphasis on muscle hypertrophy as well as maximal strength, which is what I've tried to highlight here in this top graph. Generally on Monday, there was an emphasis on the squat movement pattern, Friday was a hinge or a deadlift pattern, and the Wednesday in this example was an upper body and accessory day. Given the importance of lower body strength and cycling being unilateral in nature as you push down on the pedals, there was a big emphasis on the single leg strength, which is why the leg press was prescribed here twice per week. I was okay with the athlete pushing this one pretty hard and coming in slightly fatigued during their other primary strength lift, because there might be a little bit of leg fatigue, but not enough that the trunk strength or stability was also reduced. So if the lift were to fail, it will be due to the leg output and not the trunk, which may not normally be the case with our athletes lifting heavy loads more than 2 times body weight. Once the athlete progressed throughout the year and he was lifting really high loads during their squat and deadlifts, I did make the switch and include these first. And not forgetting that the more functional mass will likely assist with producing higher forces and power outputs, there were times where we were taking exercises to close proximity to failure in order to maximize our stimulus. When this was for the lower body accessory strength lifts, this was also done unilaterally, as you can see during the knee flexion and extension and hip thrust exercises on day 2. For power, while this was somewhat of a lower priority during GPP, I would always keep in some Olympic lifting and plyometric exercises in order to develop an athlete's technical competencies, because later down the track I needed them to be able to execute the exercises with good technique and at high relative loads. One of the other considerations that I think is important when designing training programs for sprint cyclists is to think about dynamic correspondence or transfer of training. The work from Verkhoshansky and Melsif suggests that there are 5 domains that should be considered and lead into the specific physical preparation phase that I placed higher emphasis on the regions of force production, aka developing strength through specific ranges of motion, the dynamics of efforts, selecting exercises that are high in force and those that are also high in velocity in order to improve power outputs, rate of force max or improving RFD with isometrics or Olympic lifting exercises from static positions, and finally contraction mode with isometric and concentric modes having a high degree of transfer to the bike. During the SPP phases, there was a shift in priorities to enhance maximal strength and power. So we're lifting at intensities equal to or greater than 85% of 1RM, but with 1 or 2 reps in reserve. Given that I was attempting to maximize the dynamic correspondence, the exercise range of motions were reduced in this phase, and an example you can see here is shifting from a full back squat to a box squat, and for the straight bar deadlift to be replaced with a split stance position and sometimes elevated on a 5 to 10 centimeter box. In order to prescribe the intensities or loads for these new exercises, I would begin with 90 to 100% of their full range of motion loads. In this case, our athlete back squat max was 220 kilos, and so I wouldn't want to apply too much of an additional load on the spine for multiple sets and reps, as the athlete might not be conditioned to do it. So typically, each week we would then add 10 kilos to the bar until we deemed it was heavy enough and the athlete was also able to maintain stability. And that's why the single leg press exercises was still so important. We could target knee extension strength with a high stable exercise using loads that were 3.5 to 4 times body weight. As we look through this program now as well, you may notice an undulating style of periodization throughout the week, with higher volumes and intensities on day 1 and 3, and a larger emphasis on speed power qualities on day 2. To highlight here, a power clean from blocks to enhance rate of force development, and the rear foot elevated split squat, or the Bulgarian split squat, used with bands in order to manipulate the strength curve, making the exercise more difficult closer to full extension, primarily overloading the glutes, as well as increasing concentric acceleration. The external loads used here were still slightly lower as previous phases, but 1.5 times body weight, with bands adding an additional 30 to 40 kilos at the top of the lift. Depending on the time of the year and relative to when our athlete had to compete, the accessory strength and trunk exercises may have still been in or removed from this program. For the upper body, this prescription that you see here is a maintenance dose from week to week, while the posterior chain exercises for hamstring and calf being twice per week may still have been enough volume to stimulate some growth and strength stimulus. Now on to our final phases, leading us into competition. The calendar and periodization plan worked nicely multiple times for this, in that we ran a 2-week cycle during our unloading or tapering phases, and what I described in the previous slide is a close example of the planning that you would have seen in the top table. 2 strength and power days on Monday and Friday, with an RFD or power day during the Wednesday session. The final 2 weeks leading into competition saw this flip to 2 RFD power days, with 1 heavy stimulus at the back end of the week before multiple days of recovery over the weekend. At this point, I took out all accessory items and focused on some of the big rocks in training. Lift heavy, lift fast, and do so with minimal fatigue throughout the session, with the exercise prescription aimed to potentiating the CNS for the track session later in the day. This is the final 2-week unloading phase into a competition. It's important to note here that the week of competition there would be no gym, and so you could consider this a 3-week unloading phase. The strength and power day on the left-hand side, our athlete had some autonomy over exercise selection here and decided to keep attacking the box squat, with around 20 to 30% reduction in maximum load compared to previous weeks. There's an emphasis on moving the bar quickly and monitored using GymAware. On the right-hand side, an example of the RFD/power day. And you can see from the video, I still emphasize max force or RFD with this knee isometric push. The prescription here was 5 repetitions of 1 second duration, completed twice, and finished with some plyometric activities. Thus, our power day was high isometric force, high rate of force development, and some unloaded activities for enhancing the stretch shortening cycle ability. And now we're on to our results section. And first up in the determining factors of sport performance for sprint cycling was the change in mass, or specifically change in muscle mass, which was assessed in this case study using whole body DEXA twice in this training year. The results you see here on the screen are in grams, but I'll try to discuss in kilograms to make it easier to understand. Overall, there was a 4.7 kilo increase in lean mass, with the large majority of this being attributed to an increase in trunk mass, almost 4 kilos. So the trunk here would be associated with the glutes or upper glutes through to the upper chest, shoulder and posterior as well, but not the arms, which are measured separately. Unfortunately, with this analysis, we are unable to determine if the change was posterior or anterior. Surprisingly, there's no real change in lower body lean mass outside of the measurement error, which begs the question, is this a physical quality that is already maxed out in this particular athlete, or do we need more volume to push these numbers up? Regarding maximal dynamic strength, over the first two GPP and SPP cycles, where the squat and deadlift were in the program each week, what you can see is an incremental load and improvement across the 12-week training block, where we maxed out and got new PBs in both his back squat 1RM and his deadlift 1RM. His back squat went from 210 to 220, and that's almost a 5% change compared to the previous year. And his deadlift, huge increase from 230 to 260, or an increase in 30 kilos or 13%. These values are equal to 2.3 times body weight for the squat and 2.7 times body weight for the deadlift, which is really impressive and sits him within the 95th percentile within his training cohort in sprint cyclists in Australia. The figure on the bottom right is just another example of a change in strength that we could capture across a season, this time looking at maximal isometric strength, a more than 300 Newton change in the iso split squat that you saw in one of the previous videos. Now we're looking at the extended version of this athlete's dynamic maximal strength through the different phases across the year. In the first phase, up until the middle portion of this graph, we attacked the full range of motion back squat, and then we shifted the exercise selection to a box squat. And again, what you can see is an incremental increase in load across the weeks, with a bit of a deload leading into a comp there in November before he started to reload again. But his max estimated RM for this was 270 to 280 kilos. A similar pattern is seen when we shift our straight bar deadlift to a split stance deadlift. So the feat of strength now is with loads equal to 250 kilos. They're from a split stance, so much higher levels of force going through a single leg in the front position. And the other mainstay dynamic strength lift in the program was the single leg press, with peak loads of 400 kilos and an estimated RM anywhere from 440 to 450 kilograms. When I couldn't just rely on the maximum loads lifted, I closely monitored mean velocity of his primary strength lifts. In this example, we're looking at his loads and mean velocities during the barbell back squat across each month. And now we can see a slight upward shift and rightwards into the curve. Ultimately, when using the same absolute numbers, so 140 kilos, which represents around 60% of his max, and 170 kilos, representing 80% of his max, which we would typically always use in his warm-up sets, there was an increase in mean velocity across the season, and this was maintained all the way through to national championships. So just another way to show that it was a change in strength and we were able to maintain these physical qualities right up to when peak performances were occurring. Now looking at maximum power, the lower body during counter movement jump and our squat jump tests on the force plates. Each month, linked to week 1 of each training mesocycle, our athlete completed both tests. And the research shows really strong correlations with these tests to sprint times in elite cyclists. There was a moderate increase in counter movement jump performance, equal to 5% change across the season, but a much larger change in the concentric dominant squat jump test of 16%, or a 7.4 centimeter increase in jump height, with corresponding improvements in both concentric impulse and power. During week 1 of every mesocycle, our physiologist would perform on-bike performance testing. This would provide information on peak torques, peak cadences, and peak power for our athlete. There was an incremental rise in these metrics from May until December, when our athlete was performing extremely well on the track. And in this last data point, we see a large drop-off in performance. It's likely due to some accumulated fatigue, which we'll also see on the next slide. But for me, this test is clearly linked with that transfer question. Is the gym program working? Well, peak torque and power improved across the season. And while it's hard to separate the gym strength work and the track work on the bike, The overall combination of both training modes improved performance if we look at the lab-based testing results. Now finally, our athletes' performance times. I mentioned that our athlete performances had relatively stalled in the previous two national championships. His flying 200-metre effort in the qualifying sprint was coming in at 9.8 seconds. He'd opened up with the same time in his first local races of the season and hit a 0.1 metres per second PB at our state championships. He then backed up with similar performances at other local state races in December before dropping an absolute bomb of a performance at the UCI Nations Cup in March. This was now post-Olympics, which he wasn't selected for, and so one of his first opportunities to join the national team and perform at an international event. So this was a huge increase in performance and showed really good progress across the season. And then 2 weeks later, due to a number of reasons, but fatigue most likely being one of them, he was up at that 9.79 second for his next qualifying sprint. But I thought it's important to include in the context of the athletes' performances across the season. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation and thanks for watching. If you'd like to reach out, you can do so via email or my social media. I'd be more than happy to chat.
Go, 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 go. Keep it coming. Push, 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 push. Push, Max. Let's go. 1, rest.